microphones have to be very close. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Alan Levine, and on behalf of the Political Theory Institute, my colleague Tom Merrill, and President Alger Civic Life Initiative, welcome to tonight's event on the future of conservatism. We did an event on the future of progressivism last week, and a recording of that is available on the Political Theory Institute website's homepage. We have 3 more events after spring break. Ian Shapiro from Yale will be speaking on populism and why we're so angry. Roosevelt Montas from Columbia will be speaking on rescuing Socrates, how the great books changed my life and why they matter for a new generation. And Nathan Tarkov, University of Chicago, on Machiavelli, poet and lover. But tonight we're here to reflect on the future of conservatism in the United States, which lacks a clear trajectory. Donald Trump exploded the modern American conservative movement, which consisted of an uneasy alliance of traditionalism, libertarianism, neoconservatism, and the religious right. And Trump has recreated the Republican Party in his own image. In some conservative intellectual circles, there are calls for America to become a Catholic integralist state and for other forms of illiberalism. After Trump, whither conservatism? To help us think this through, we have 2 eminently qualified conservatives with different perspectives. Both have spoken at Political Theory Institute events in the past, and it's a pleasure to welcome them back. Megan McArdle described herself as a right-leaning libertarian. She's a columnist for the Washington Post, and her work has appeared in outlets including the New York Times, The Economist, The Atlantic, Newsweek, The Guardian, Time, The Wall Street Journal. She's also the author of The Upside of Down, Why Failing Well is the Key to Success. She earned her BA in English Literature at the University of Pennsylvania and an MBA at the University of Chicago. Joshua Mitchell is a leading public intellectual. I said of the new right, he's not entirely comfortable with that description. It's too echoing of the alt-right, and he doesn't go there. He's a professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University and was provost, rector, and acting chancellor of the American University of Iraq, Sulaymaniyah. He's the author of 5 books, including most recently, American Awakening, Identity Politics and Other Afflictions of Our Time. He helped found the journal American Greatness. He has a BA from the University of Michigan, an MA in Sociology from the University of Washington, and an MA and PhD in Political Science from the University of Chicago. So please join me in welcoming both of our speakers, and Josh Mitchell will speak first. Each of the speakers will talk for 20 or 25 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience.
Thank you. Thank you. I am a political theorist, which means I always take the long view of things. Yes, I am nervous about the term the new right. Donald Trump did indeed blow up the conservative movement, Conservative Party in 2016. But since the time I first read Democracy in America, which would have been as an unemployed graduate student in 1990, I opened the author's introduction and read 11 pages of it and closed it and said, well, you'll spend the rest of your life with this book. And I have.
Josh, a little bit more.
Okay. So, yeah, I'm Tocqueville in my bones. And that what that means really is that you've got a strange relationship to the conservative movement. It is true that in 1994, when Gingrich controlled the House, he held up 2 books. One was Hayek and the other was Tocqueville, and said, these are our Bibles. But it's not clear to me at all that aside from platitudes about family values, tradition, et cetera, that there's been a deep engagement with Tocqueville. And my view is, unless conservatives do enter into that engagement, this is not going to end well. I want to take some of the oldsters back. In 1990s, yes, there were lots of problems, and yes, Bill Clinton was roundly excoriated by many people on the right, but there was an amazing moment in the 1990s when members of both the left and the right saw that because of the institutional atrophy in America, Tocqueville really was the guy. Harvey Manfield translates democracy in America when in the early 1990s. Why? Because the left had, through Putnam and others, seen that the model really was Tocqueville for revitalizing Eastern Europe. Anyway, there was an amazing, I'll say convergence, perhaps it's too strong, but there was an awareness, both on the left and the right, that we needed to rebuild our society. We need to rebuild the mediating institutions. And then, of course, 2001 happened, and we have the national security state. And 2008, and we have concentration of wealth like we've never had before. That is a big problem, and I think you can't understand the new conservative movement without the trauma, thinking about the trauma of 2001 and 2008. I do want to frame this in Tocqueville. So if you're interested in this Tocquevillian idea of rebuilding liberty at the mediational layer, there are three perils. One has been well known for a very long time, and that's the peril of institutional atrophy. The Quest for Community by Nisbet, Bella, Putnam, all these people for the last, since the 1950s, have been saying that there's institutional atrophy, bowling alone. This has been well known. But my view is there's actually now two additional threats, and one of them is identity politics. And the way it is a threat is that if identity politics impugns these traditional institutions as being impure, then they have to be modified or eliminated. And the third option is what I call problem, is what I call substitutism, and this is the social media problem. Look, we need to have real friends, and we can have supplements to those real friendships, and that's what social media is. But we can't turn those supplements into substitutes. And my view is the further erosion that's happening in these mediating institutions is because of social media substitutism. I'll come back to that perhaps. I do think that the best way to understand identity politics is, as Tocqueville said, not about identity politics, but about the general movement of history, as an incomplete religion. He saw this in the 1850s when writing The Old Regime in the French Revolution. And his claim was this: you do not move from a religious society to a secular society. It doesn't happen. What you always do is you move to the ghost of your religious society. You have incomplete religions. And he saw the French Revolution as the first incomplete religion. And I think it's safe to say that Marxism is the second incomplete religion. And identity politics, I would submit, is the third incomplete religion. And I'll say more about this in a minute, but the central category of identity politics is the category of the innocent victim. And I don't think conservatives have much to say about that. And that's what I want to talk about here. There has been a reshifting within the conservative movement. After Trump was elected, Yoram Hazony gathered, I don't know, 40 or 50 people together and said, well, what just happened? This is the basis of the NatCon movement. And what was really remarkable was that everybody in the room said some variant of this. Well, you know, I supported free markets, but I never really supported free markets. Well, I supported the land wars, but I was never really in favor of the land wars. We built this coalition, or the conservatives built this coalition based on opposition, but it really didn't have a kind of internal coherence. And I think what's happened since Trump blew up rotting flesh Reaganism, to use Rusty Reno's language, and the neoconservative movement, I think there's been a tremendous period of great conversations. Some people have been pushed aside, to be sure. I am a little worried that the Tocquevillian vision isn't central to it. But as a general rule, even though there has been a slight recalibration, I said to the students a few minutes ago, what has changed decisively is that the old free market veto over concerns for tradition, families, localism, et cetera, that's no longer self-evident. I think Yoram and his group, I'm part of it, I think that's one of the things we've really made clear. I'll use Yuval's language. I don't think he'd be upset. We have a lot to answer for in this free marketism, because what happened was we completely forgot that you've got to have a middle class, you've got to have a manufacturing base. All that was forgotten. And now I think conservatives are moving in that direction. That is a good thing. I don't know if it's going to be the most important thing in the new conservative movement, but but it's important. However, here's the problem. I think in general, conservatives think that now that they've made that shift, everything's fine. And my answer is no, it's not fine at all. And the way I want to get at this problem is by talking very briefly about what I call the three economies. And I'm suggesting that conservatives understand the first two economies and the left understands the third economy. So the first economy is the economy we all know, the economy of payments and debts. It's what Adam Smith wrote about. It's Hayek and all the rest, and it's wonderful, and we know about it, and it's great. And then there's a second economy that's in tension with it, and that is I call it the economy of tradition. It's the debts and payments we owe to our forefathers. These are different economies. I think within the conservative movement, there's been a tension between these two for a very, very long time. And when Yoram had that group and they all said what they said, what that really meant was we're no longer going to pretend that tension doesn't exist. That the debt that we owe our fathers and our forefathers, tradition, is one we're not going to ignore. We have to recover these things. So that has been the shift. I think it's a good thing. But my point is there's actually a third economy. So there's the economy of money, the economy of tradition, the payments and debts we owe to our forefathers. But this third one is what I call the spiritual economy. And this is the economy of that identity politics works within. It's the economy of purity and stain. Here, payments, we have to be clear, payments cannot really be made. There's irredeemable stain. And you can't pay it back. This is the Christian idea of original sin. And so what I say to my conservative friends is, okay, it's great that you've rebalanced things a little bit, and you understand that the free market can't be the sole concern. But the bottom line is this identity politics thing, I do not think has been vanquished by the election. The funding may dissipate, but what we have to understand is that the left has a very powerful understanding. I think it's ultimately distorted, but what they get is that there's a deeper economy than what tradition and what the free market gets. And people who are on the left and talk about the right think that market commerce is really quite irrelevant. It doesn't get to the deepest economy of payment and debt. The tradition is deeply distorted because it's wrapped up in stain and impurity, slavery, for example. And so the left is really talking very much past the conservatives who've done a slight realignment here, but they don't understand this problem of spiritual debt. I said to the class earlier, we think of human beings as rational maximizers, and that's all true. We have our preferences. But the fascinating thing about the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century is that we have these cataclysmic events or recollections of cataclysmic events made possible by our TV shows, Walter Cronkite in the 1960s, of black kids getting sprayed by fire hoses. All of a sudden, all this guilt comes out. Colonialism, 2 world wars, the Holocaust, in America, slavery. And it's precisely at that moment, I think, that the churches begin to falter. The mainline churches, I think, falter because of the Vietnam War. We know why the churches faltered in Europe in the 20th century. But precisely when you needed some kind of mechanism of atonement for guilt, it completely disappeared. And my argument is that what's happened is not that not that we've moved to a world without religion. It's rather that all those nuns that Pew Charitable Trust talks about are people who are trying to find a way to address the problem of stain and guilt without the church. And the way they're doing it is through identity politics. It's a specification of a set of relationships of purity and stain. And once you understand the intersectional scores, you know where you stand, you know what you need to do. I said to the class a few minutes ago that one of the necessary acts, if you're involved in this identity politics atonement ritual, is the Passover ritual. You have to place over the lintel of your door the blood of innocents so that social death will pass you by. You know this story from the Old Testament. So my sense of this is people in America are spending huge amounts of energy in trying to work through this problem of debt. And I would say the right is in a way tone deaf to this problem, because the right will talk about religious values and family values, but they don't want to get into the why identity politics is a deformation of Christianity. And my view is, unless you do that, the people who are practicing identity politics will continue on with this, what Tocqueville called incomplete religion, for a very, very long time. It seems to have been vanquished. Certainly the funding sources are being cut, but I don't think it's the case that 50 to 100 million Americans who believe in their bones that innocent victimhood and stain and purity have to be worked out in the world of time with respect to others. I don't think that disappears overnight. And so I'll end with this, and of course there's lots more to say, but I think the conservative movement has retooled. It's shifting more towards concerns with middle class. Orrin Cass and others are writing about unions. I mean, this would have been unthinkable in the Reagan era. These are good things, but it seems to me that there's still a deep blindness that conservatives have about this third economy that the left really gets and has so much power. It's in a way more powerful than the other two economies. Because unless you work out the problem of purity and stain, you're not going to defend your tradition. And you're going to think, well, ordinary market commerce isn't that important because we've got this stain over here that has to be addressed. And so AOC, we have to spend $50 trillion. It doesn't matter how much it costs to attend to this deeper stain, which only the spiritual economy can comprehend. So we're in a very strange moment in America. It seems that this identity politics thing has been vanquished. It seems that conservatives have regrouped. I am concerned, I'll just flag it, I am concerned with the alt-right, the Nietzschean alt-right, and I just don't think Roman Catholic integralism will work. But I think the bigger problem is the conservatives just don't understand the power of this identity politics. And the reason Trump won, I'll just say this last thing, is because he is a white man without guilt. And that category cannot exist in the identity politics world. We have to grasp this. He has no guilt whatsoever. And there are a lot of very, very angry people who voted for him. And I say to my friends on the right, okay, fine, it's a terrible thing that you have been labeled irredeemably stained. But finally, we have to build a world. We have to build a Tocquevillian world. All of our institutions are fragile. The State Department, okay, fine, there's all sorts of excess, but we have to have a noble State Department. We have to have noble people in government. And my worry is, right now, there's so much anger, so much pushback against identity politics. We're not thinking coherently about what the next step is.
Thank you. Megan McArdle.
Hi, yes. I'm afraid that we're going to have more overlap than I necessarily expected, the libertarian and more traditional conservative. But so I'm actually going to start by talking a little bit about the left and what has happened to the left in the last 10 years or so. And I will say, starting about 5 years ago, I noticed a very strange thing, which is that all conversations converged to trans. I would go to dinner parties, I would go out for drinks, I would go to conferences and be hanging out with people afterwards, and it didn't matter where the conversation started. It always ended up at trans. So why was this happening? It was because there was an orthodoxy that most people didn't agree with and were weirded out by, which was not that we should treat trans people with dignity and make sure they can get housing and medical care, but that there are literally no differences between biological males and biological females. And in fact, probably biological sex isn't even real anyway. There's certainly not just two of them. That children should be able to transition. They know who they are. That these procedures that had very weak evidence base, that to even question whether they should be done was transphobic. I mean, all of the litany that we no longer had mothers, we had parenting people, we had people with cervixes, we had people with uteruses, women who had fought for the right to be more than their biology were suddenly back to being little bits of themselves. And this was not popular on the left. One of the most interesting experiences for me was in 2022, I started to write about the Leah Thomas controversy. She was a swimmer at Penn who had transitioned, had been on the men's team, had been ranked about number 500 in the country, began swimming on the women's team and was number 1 in the country. In her events, this obviously caused a lot of foofara. And so I was not particularly interested in the topic of women's sports or indeed trans, but I do have a sideline because I'm a very tall woman in trying to explain to women that being as tall as a man does not mean being as strong as a man, as I discovered in college when my boyfriend, who weighed less than me, effortlessly pinned me during a playful wrestling match. And so I thought, well, this is crazy. Why are we arguing about this? If you've been through male puberty, obviously you have athletic advantages. And someone name checked me in this debate and was like, well, yeah, sure, Megan McArdle's an outlier, but she exists. I was like, I can't swim as fast as a biological male. I don't know what you're talking about. And so I wrote this column, and what was surprising was that if you had seen the tenor of the coverage at the time, what you would have assumed was like, most people are on board with this. I mean, yeah, sure, there's some conservative holdouts and some bigots, but most people support this. And what was interesting was that when I told people, very liberal people who I knew, that what I was writing about, it was the opposite. People were unloading on me about how unfair this was and how terrible it was, and no columnist in the entire mainstream media, as far as I know, had written that. And I actually didn't end up writing that either, because my interest was just in telling people they were wrong about testosterone. But that thing led to this feeling of being sort of unclear what was going on, made people obsessed with it. They couldn't talk about anything else because they weren't allowed to talk about it in public. And so in private, that's all they did talk about. Conservatives capitalized on that. Obviously, what was the biggest, most successful ad of the 2024 campaign? It was the famous Kamala Harris they them ad. Kamala Harris is for they them, Trump is for you. Featured her talking at a Transform the White House was the name of the event, where she's talking about her wonderful work in California, getting surgeries for prisoners. And I was writing a column on the ad, and I went and looked at it. I was like, this is going to be taken out of context. And this was the only time actually in political ad history, as far as I can tell, it was absolutely not taken out of context. It was a completely faithful rendition of what she had said. And this issue broke the Democratic Party. Now, whatever your feelings about this was an 80-20 issue on the non-progressive side. Most people do not wish to be referred to as chest feeding or birthing people. Most people do not believe that literally trans women are women, and therefore it is completely inappropriate to have any space at all that is separate for biological women, such as a prison or a sporting league. And the Democratic Party was completely out of touch with that. Their candidates were going way overboard on an issue that was going to play badly, as indeed it eventually did. The thing is that it's also broken the Republican Party, because one thing that I have noticed since the election is they won. They won on this issue. The vibe has shifted. Mainstream newspapers are questioning gender-affirming care for minors, including me. But still, all conversations converge to trans. If you start talking about politics, you are going to end up with, but those crazy people think that there aren't two sexes, that there's like 97 and you can switch between them at will. And that is a problem for the Republican Party. It is part of a broader problem for the Republican Party, which is that identity politics has eaten the party, and it is in the process of eating the conservative movement. Obviously, what they would say is, no, we are defending against identity politics. I think, yes, in many cases, look, I am not with the Republican Party on all of these issues. That said, I think it is true that the left went way overboard on these issues in a way that was obviously not supported by the politics, but even if you say, look, we're not doing politics, we're doing morality here, it was also really ineffective. The DEI trainings are a good example of this, where it turns out that they're actually counterproductive, and they make people more resentful and actually can make people feel more antipathy to the groups they're being trained on, because they're done badly. That's not to say you cannot do good trainings that aim to reduce those kinds of frictions, which are inevitable in a diverse workshop, but no one in a workplace, but no one ever tried to figure out what those were. They just hired random people to come in and tell basically them that white men were bad. And that was a huge mistake. It was a political mistake, but it was also a practical mistake. But the problem for conservatives is that they have made the inverse of that mistake, which is that the fight against identity politics, and more broadly, the fight against the institutions that promoted identity politics, in which they feel have been unfair to conservatives, has come to dominate everything else. Now, I think conservatives would find this an unfair characterization, and they would say, look, we have a positive vision. Democrats have a positive vision. Whatever else you want to say about them, if you think about what they want to do, you can name a lot of stuff they want to do. They want to build public transit. They want to fight climate change. They want to do care economy. They want to do, universal health care for all and all the rest of it. You may think that those plans are bad, that they wouldn't work, that they're not worth the trade-offs, but they have a bunch of things they want to do. And the things that they are fighting are not just other people. They are fighting conditions that countries are bad. The Republican Party and the conservative movement, or at least the conservatives that I'm watching, have become obsessed with one thing, which is fighting their opponents and everything their opponents do. They are a reaction. And in the process, they're becoming a lesser, darker reflection of the Democratic Party and the progressive movement, rather than having a positive vision, because most people are not that invested in the kind of ideological fights. What they want is, what is my way of life? What are you promising me? What happens if I go there? And that's not to say that there are not people who are thinking about this, including Joshua Mitchell. But I think the problem with those fights is that first of all, they're not reflected in our politics. What is the Trump administration actually doing? Okay, well, he's putting some tariffs on and taking them off, and putting them on and taking them off, so that he can claim quick political victories. But mostly, what is the thing that we are mostly watching? It is destroying international alliances, and it is running roughshod through the bureaucracy and the universities and any other source of left-wing institutional power that he can reach. And look, I'm a longtime critic of how institutions, including the mainstream media, have used their institutional power. I feel like I have been, for the past 10 years, standing on the prow of the ship, screaming at my fellow passengers, stop, turn the ship back, you will kill us all, you fools. There have been an enormous number, I think an enormous number of genuine mistakes, a huge epistemic closure and groupthink problem, where the fact that there were no conservatives in the room meant we got a lot of questions wrong. There were a lot of questions we didn't ask because we didn't think to ask them and no one else was there. I think there are real problems. I think that academia made a huge mistake in going all in on progressive politics in the way that they did over the last 10 years. And, I've had professors, you can read my column in the Washington Post, by the way, subscriptions, very affordable, fantastic deal. And if gifting also, my column today is about this topic, about the fact that academia ultimately picked this fight. They took on conservatism. They sort of kicked conservatives out. And I understand that there's a two-way thing. There's a pipeline problem. More liberals want to go into academia, but when it's other groups that are underrepresented, academia did not accept, well, I think they probably just don't want to be here as an answer. In fact, what they understand is they have created that when you have an overwhelming majority, it creates a hostile environment for the minority. And you got to do a little more work. And you certainly don't want, I've heard horror stories about people getting up at hiring meetings and just saying, oh, no, we don't want any pro-life white men here. Blatantly illegal, by the way, I'd never say that. That is a lawsuit waiting to happen. But at the same time, okay, once you've done all that, you've smashed the bureaucracy, you've destroyed those liberal academics, what do you do for an encore? Because do you think that the average person is really obsessed? First of all, the average person does not go to college. I think the average person is really obsessed with what happens in the Harvard faculty lounge. Right. And so here is the thing, is that, for all of the right's talk about they're focusing on the middle class now, they're doing unions, they're doing this, mostly what they're actually focused on is intra-elite status battles with other people who, by the way, all live in the same cities and college towns that they do, who all went to the same collection of elite schools that they did. They're still actually mostly fighting this intra-elite status battle instead of thinking about, okay, what are we offering? What is our positive vision of life? And more importantly, how do we get there? Right. So I can describe, I think, many people might quarrel with me, but like, look, if I describe what the new right vision of the good life is, it's a world where it's easy to form families, where it's easy to feel to be at home in a deep community, where you feel like you have status, you have a secure place, you have security, which is really important. You're not worried constantly that your job's going to be shipped to China. That men and women view themselves as complementary rather than as like absolutely alike. And that doesn't mean that women don't work, but it does mean that you understand that men and women are different and they might play slightly different roles in a marriage on average and all the rest of it. That people are sustained by faith and community and by local institutions, and they're not sustained by mass media and the government. Right? And like, I think in many ways, this is a pretty compelling vision. We would quarrel on many of the details. I do not think tariffs work. I do not think that unionization is going to bring the 1950s back. I think that was a collection of technological and social arrangements that is not recoverable. But I think there's something really appealing in a lot of that. Okay, but is that just going to like magically grow out of the ruins of, you know, Yale's campus? Or are you going to have to actually do some work? And are conservatives or Republicans describing that work? Are they doing that work? And so let me like think about a few things that if I were going to describe what is that work, right? So first of all, it's being in those communities and building them. So one thing that is clear to me that the death of the small towns and places like Youngstown, Ohio, that a lot of that is driven by the fact that all of the most ambitious and together kids left and moved to a bigger city. Maybe it's Nashville or Austin now instead of New York or Chicago, but they left and they're not there running the Rotary and staffing the Little League and all the rest of it. Right? If you're going to build those communities back up, you got to be in those communities. Where is the new right? They're in California and New York and, you know, some university towns. They're not out in Youngstown doing the work. And that's a big challenge. Are they sustaining those communities, or do they have their kids in travel sports too? And do they spend every weekend going around, you know, shuttling the kids to tournament after tournament? I don't know. Maybe that you could call that a sustainable.
Large London
But
fog.
that's I think in many ways
milk,
inimical to
please.
building the kind of localism that the new.
Can I
right
get that
talks
with vanilla syrup?
What about institutions? Are they doing the institutional work? Yes. Maybe you could argue,
then
I will
what
listen to
bagels
this
do you
argument.
have?
Maybe you can argue that you actually need to smash academia and the bureaucracy before you can reform them. That they are too insular, too sclerotic, they can't change. I don't agree entirely, but I will listen to that argument and we can talk about it. But what are your plans for building back? The government, whatever you think the government should be doing, and I think a lot of the stuff the New Right wants to do, like getting social media to be nicer to conservatives, although that's less of an issue now that Elon Musk has bought Twitter. But just all of it, regulation, all of this industrial policy, doesn't that imply a fairly large and competent cadre of conservative bureaucrats? And where are those people coming from? Are you encouraging that pipeline? Are you building the schools to train them? Conservatives ought to be making a federalist society for every discipline out there, for the bureaucracy, for business schools. There is actually one, the Adam Smith Society, run through the Manhattan Institute, but for public policy schools, and not like little conservative groups, but a huge, robust network that funnels people into doing the institutional work that conservatives want done. Because if you don't, then institutions that are liberal are going to fill that gap. Conservatives need to be serious about institution building if they want to be serious about changing things. And so I think that you know, the big problem for the conservative movement is that right now they are locked in their obsession with their own. And you know, I remember after the pandemic, I went to a dinner shortly after lockdown ended. And I was asked to do something on the economy. And at the end of it, a conservative academic, who shall remain nameless, asked me, like, why didn't you talk about woke stuff? And I was like, Well, I think that's a big problem for me personally. Look, I lived through a mainstream media institution from 2020 to 2022. I do not want to hear anyone tell me I don't know what the problem is. Okay. People used to call me up and be like, "Are you fired?" And I was like, "I don't know. We'll find out." No, I joke. The Washington Post was actually like quite supportive, but it was a frightening time to be an even modestly right wing, because you knew the mob might come after you every day. Even if they didn't get you fired, they were going to make your life pretty unpleasant for a long time. And so I understand why this obsesses the new right, who come out of these institutions, who come out of elite schools, who come out of elite media sometimes, who certainly write for elite media sometimes. But that's not that's not going to solve the opioid crisis. And it's not going to solve any of the other problems, the real problems that conservatives point to. It's not going to help young people form families. It's not going to teach people how to be decent parents and decent spouses and friends. It is not going to do any of that. And I don't see that the new right is doing that work, because the work ultimately is mostly not political. It's not the part where we just like argue about who's right and who's wrong about some policy issue. It is, I think actually conservatives are right about this and progressives are wrong, that this is the traditional conservative argument has been, this is deep cultural work. You cannot make people not be racist by putting them in a corner and telling them they're bad people. You cannot force it. You cannot make rules against evil. You can make rules against evil behavior, but you cannot change hearts and minds without doing deep, patient, long cultural work where you are, not from afar. And I worry that conservatives have lost that message, that the most precious things that we do build are the things we build one-on-one between people, the most enduring things that we build, sometimes the worst things we build. You know, if you've lived in a small town, you know they can be punishing places in some ways. But the thing is, that cannot happen by government fiat, and it cannot happen if you just raise the people who thought that they could do it differently. What conservatives need to do is demonstrate that there is a better way to do it, and they know what that is.
Okay, well, thank you both. Before we open it up to the audience, I'd just like to maybe follow up a little bit on where the two of you agree and differ, if at all. And in terms of agreement, I heard both of you talk a lot about identity politics as a problem, and both of you talk about local government, or not even local government, but local institutions and people working together face to face, just as the really the only way to solve the problems, and not on the level of government. So those are two areas at least of a large amount of agreement. Where else would you say that you agree, and is there any disagreement that you heard?
I've gone back and forth on this thing of identity politics as a religion. You know, I certainly see some religious elements to it. It's sort of famous. I remember John McWhorter, before he wrote his book, I saw him or on a Zoom, and he told me that he thought it was a religion. And I said, I do not think that is correct. And then I saw a picture of someone at a George Floyd protest who, like some white people who were literally just kneeling to a random black person at the protest. And I was like, what are you doing? That is a very, what? And then I got a little more persuaded. But look, I think it shares some of those. I think it is sacred, right? Like people treated these questions as sacred, which means you can't question them. You're not allowed to, like, you don't go into, actually, I shouldn't say that. You can actually absolutely go to my Catholic priest and be like, I'm not so sure about this Trinity thing. Let's talk. But, you know, there were sacred precepts you were not supposed to ever questioned. There were people who were allowed to talk and people who weren't. But I actually think it was not less religious than an orthodoxy. And I think that's a kind of important distinction for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that there's a spiritual aspect. If you're a religious believer, there is a spiritual aspect, a supernatural aspect that I think was absent from this, and that's somewhat important. And I think there are orthodoxies on lots of things. And one question I've asked myself, and I don't have an answer to it, is look, I was born in 1973, which is now a frighteningly long time ago. And I took free speech culture for granted. I just took the idea that like we Americans really believe in free speech. And the thing is, like, what I thought we Americans really believe in emerged at Berkeley in the 60s. It was not this long-standing, beautiful American tradition. It was really a quite late invention, both of the Supreme Court jurisprudence and the cultural stuff. And I sort of wonder if that's stable. If the idea that you can literally just question anything isn't weird. Maybe societies just need to put some stuff off limits so that we stop arguing about it. And maybe, we really at one point had one question which was off limits, which was, is pedophilia okay? Answer, no. I agree with that answer to be extremely clear, and I'm not looking to relitigate it. But maybe that's not normal, and most societies do that. And that what I actually took as what America is like was really just a liminal period between the crash of one orthodoxy and the creation of another. But now that orthodoxy has crashed, I am going back to we Americans are just ornery and we like free speech. But I don't think it's religious per se. In part because I don't think it was filling many of the positive aspects of religion, right? Going to a George Floyd protest is not the same thing as getting up in the morning and going to church on Sunday when you'd really rather stay in bed. And getting up and going in the Wednesday potluck, even though you are like heartily sick of the women you're on the committee with. That is, that kind of community building is thick. And the supernatural element of it is thick. And the actual, most of what was happening with identity politics and cancel culture was quite thin. It consisted of hitting retweet. And I think that that's a big difference.
I mean, I obviously think it's more religious, but then we have to raise the question, what do we even mean by the term religious? I take a fundamental problem to be addressing guilt. And the churches have historically done this using the Christian trope of the innocent victim. I think if you take away the category of the innocent victim from identity politics, I don't know what you have. But the category of the innocent victim is the central Christian category. So it's minimally derivative. It's a shadow. It's a ghost of. It's thin. The reason why I think it's important to point it out is because a lot of people want to say, well, this will pass and everything's going to be fine. But my view is what really is at stake is whether a people can live without something called a religion, by which I mean a way of thinking through guilt and transgression. And I don't mean, what I owe Uncle so-and-so because he helped pay my college. I mean, at a much deeper level. So I think that's what Nietzsche said. That's what the crisis of the West was. So we'll wait and see. I don't think it's going to go away. Where we completely agree is the real work is not political here. And I was thinking about the sociology of the first few weeks of the Trump administration. I have many students who came out of or didn't complete their program, their PhD at Georgetown. They would have been spectacular political theorists. And they would have gotten tenure track positions. They were white guys. They would have gotten tenure track positions any other time. And then most importantly, and I think this is to your point, they would have learned that in the course of 7 years of getting tenure, you become acculturated. You learn that no fast tempers are going to work here. You're going to have to make compromises, all the difficult labor of building a world together. Here's a group of young men who never had those positions, who are heading up think tanks and magazines, and they're now being put in the Trump administration. They have not had long experience with community building. So yes, I'm a little bit nervous, but like you, given how much I think the state has probably funded expressly left-wing causes, I think there's going to be an overreach on this one. And then the question you and I are raising is the one we have to pose, which is, okay, so now what? But I'm worried that you have a generation, to speak of the young men, who don't have the long institutional memory of making compromises and growing up.
So I would expand and add, and maybe a slight disagreement. Look, I think identity politics was a mistake, as I think I said at great length. But I don't think, but I would say two things. Is first of all, it is an attempt to solve real problems that exist in the world, right? Like, it was overboard that every single article written in the mainstream media for a few years had to include what the effect was on every conceivable minority group. But it is also true that there really are huge disparities in a lot of minority groups. And these people are Americans. They're here. They are part of our community. We should care about them. We should be united. I think that the solution is to unite us around our common patriotism rather than to lean into the particularist problem. But I mean, I think if I think about what a conservative version of Black Lives Matter would have been, it would have been, this is America. These are Americans, and we don't do this. This is America. These are Americans, and the police do not abuse them because this is America and these are Americans, right? I think that there are ways of framing, but police brutality is in fact, and by the way, not just a problem for Black Americans. I mean, there was a case of a guy who was shot in a hotel room. I mean, begging, just drunk and not understanding the instructions of the cops, and they shot him, and he was white. And you've never heard his name. But like, the point is, these are problems, and people were really trying to solve real problems. But I think that part of the problem was that the way they tried to solve those problems was about the problems of people in elite spaces, right? So the language policing is a good example of that. If you are an underrepresented minority, but you are working in a warehouse full of people who share your ethnic or racial group, then probably the most important thing in your life is not settling on the exact terminology of how we refer to each other or what things are microaggressions. That is a problem for an underrepresented minority in a majority white elite space. And I'm not saying it's not a real problem. Again, I am a right-leaning person in an institution that is really not right-leaning. And I am the person with the salient, I'm not saying that these are morally the same, but I understand microaggressions. They're real. I think that a lot of, if you look at what conservatives are complaining about universities, it's systemic racism, same mechanisms, affinity, people hiring people who are like them because they think people who are like them are better, right? This is the same thing. Again, not saying they're morally equivalent, but the mechanism, people gonna people. And so I think that all of those problems are real, and that conservatives should not just say, well, why are you mad? Why are you mad that people on the mainstream media say mean things about you or just microaggress you constantly? Why, when they talk about stuff that's relevant to you and they totally miss your viewpoint and they don't understand a damn thing? Or when they get up there and say really actually very nasty things about conservatives, why does that make you mad? Why do you care? Well, because you care. And that's how other people feel too. And I think actually there were, but here's the thing, is like after all of that, I just don't think it was that important. The left blew it. The left made language policing central to their, to their political campaigns. And this was definitely not the major concern on the minds of most people in those ethnic groups, right? It turned out that, like the idea that Latinos cared mostly about immigration, wildly false. It turned out that that was a mistake, but the right is making a similar mistake when they think that this is the most important issue, that this is a huge issue. It was a huge issue for you because you are in a very small handful of elite people. It is not the biggest issue for a plumbing contractor living out there in Peoria. That's not the biggest thing on his mind. And so I think it's not his biggest problem, whatever you think his problems are. And this is the thing that I think we can have an overemphasis on this on both sides. Sorry, that was an extremely long rant. It's been building up for a long time. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you both. We're going to open it up to questions now. Please wait for the microphone, and it is our tradition to allow students to ask the first question. We've got one in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for taking your time to speak with us. I just had a quick question. On your connection with church and George Floyd and the whole policing system, and then how some guy was shot because he was too drunk and we didn't even know his name. I was a bit confused on that type of connection you're trying to make, considering that the fact that the police system was built to and captured enslaved Africans. Additionally, more Black people are more subject to violent encounters with the police system. And I think that's what the George Floyd protest was trying to get at, to show how the police system foundation was on the start of racism and systematic oppression, and how it's still there today. Now, a couple of white people's kneeling to one Black person, maybe that's their own thing, but that's not what the whole George protest was initially about, but the justice of the fact that the police officer was on his neck for more than 6 minutes. So I think that's what the George protest was really about. But I was just kind of confused on how you were trying to make it about how police brutality is not only for Black people, and then you mentioned one guy's name but couldn't even give us his name. So I just want to know the connection about that. And then you also had a connection with the church thing and police brutality, and I was also trying to figure out what that was about too. Thank you.
So to start with, the police system was not founded to capture enslaved people. That is an internet meme that is false. The policing originated in the 18th and 19th century, basically, as it became more necessary, where you have people living in larger groups. Formal policing, it happens in Britain, and it's not to capture enslaved people. It happens in New York City. That is not true.
Slave patrol.
Yes, there were slave patrols. I'm not saying that those didn't exist, but they were not the basis of that's not where policing started in the United States. The slave patrols were bad. I'm against them, to be completely clear, but it's not true that that's where the origins of policing are. To answer the broader question, though, look, I'm a libertarian. I've been writing about policing problems for decades, and they're huge. Right, and they are inherent in the fact that you have given people guns to enforce the law. As I say, I think that this is a real problem, and yes, it absolutely disparately impacts African Americans, and that is a problem. What I was saying was, look, if you wanted a political message that was unifying, a message that we don't let this happen to anyone in the United States, because they are in the United States and we don't let that happen, was more likely to get long-term buy-in than one that was particularist and focused on police brutality only against Blacks. I understand, by the way, the reasons that that choice was not made. People who are in a group that feels disproportionately targeted, they don't just want to make claims as, I'm in America and you can't do this. They want redress of the collective injustice. So I get why that happened, but I think politically, if conservatives wanted to address that problem, what they should say is, we don't do this because this is America and this is not acceptable. And the problem with that is that conservatives just wanted to fight against Black Lives Matter rather than fixing the problem. And that's also tied up with the fact that crime also disproportionately affects African Americans. Most crime is intraracial. And that so depolicing also disproportionately hurt African Americans, as the African American economist Roland Fryer has pointed out, that when you have these viral policing incidences, what happens is the police pull back because they don't want to, and that what happens actually is disproportionately more homicides among African American men. And that is a problem for everyone. And I think that conservatives should take that seriously rather than arguing cops good, people good. I think we need a West Point for cops. What we need is police who do their jobs better. And no one was making that argument. It was, are police good or are police bad? And that was not a helpful argument in that moment. Defund the police was a desperate mistake as a slogan. It absolutely crushed Democrats who tried it. It crushed the movement, which didn't make progress on an incredibly serious, deep problem. If you give people guns and tell them to go on the street and police crime, this can go wrong in so many ways, even if they're well-intentioned. And to be clear, I don't think that what happened to George Floyd was well-intentioned. We should be training our police better. We should be thinking, but African Americans did not want depolicing. It was not popular in the African American community, 70% of whom said, I want more police in my neighborhood, but I want them to be better trained. And so yes, this is absolutely an extremely serious problem. And what I was trying to say was not like this wasn't a serious problem or whatever. What I was trying to say is that rather than saying, you know, I'm against that, Blue Lives Matter and all of that, what about taking this issue, recognizing that it is actually an incredibly serious problem, and if you are against identity politics, reframing it as an issue that affects America and that is therefore something that we need to solve because we are Americans and it's our obligation, and this is not the American way.
Thank you so much. Sorry, she gave me the mic because I just had a response to that. But this is America, and we are founded on like systematic oppression. We did that with the indigenous. The reason why like Black Americans here are today is because the Europeans took us from West Africa, and like America is fundamentally like racist when it comes down like to like non-white people, and putting us as in a minority, as you said, because you use the term minority, just hinder us more because we're not minorities. We're Black people or Latinas or Hispanics that happen to be marginalized. If you put us in some subject group that isn't part of the non-white group, you're also suppressing us because we're not the minority. We're just people who have been marginalized in a white supremacy system. Additionally, when it comes down to the NAACP, the National African American
National Association.
Thank you so much. It states that the origin of modern day policing can be traced back to the slave patrol in the early 17th centuries. And its mission was to establish a terror and squash slave uprising. And this is from the NAACP. My history shows that modern day policing today was because they wanted to squash and bring back enslaved Africans back to their owners, and we're still using that today. This justice system has never been just because it was never fundamentally made to have justice for non-white people. That's what I'm trying to get at. So thank you.
I respect that. I think we're getting far afield from the topic, so I will say thank you for a lively exchange.
Hello, I have one question for you, Ms. McArdle. You said that in your comparison to the religiosity of identity politics, that it's not like going to the Wednesday potluck with women that you hate or begrudgingly waking up to church. As someone who formerly existed in a Christian household, both of those sentiments reach to me. But I'm wondering if you think that identity politics or this concept of intersectionality can only exist in a form of advocacy and not as a form of bridging community.
Pass the mic to the guy in front of you, but you can answer that.
Look, I think it didn't. Whether it could, I think, is a different question, right? I think it does on college campuses, right? College campuses are this weird place where everyone has a fair amount of free time, not to slander you in any way. I know you guys work very hard, but you don't have, like, very few people tend to have kids or other things that just drag you all over all the weekend. You don't tend not to have sick parents and just the things that suck up your time when you're like my age. Also, you have so much energy. So and you're all here in a very small space. And so you form a lot of groups that you're very active with when you're on campus. But I think what you see is that they tend not to persist after you leave campus. And so outside of the college environment, which is one of my fondest memories, but just sadly, very strange place, it didn't look like a super thick community that was doing a lot of active community work. There were occasional protests. But even then, like when I was in college, to do activism, to go to a protest, you actually had to like find a flyer, and you had to go to meetings that were downtown in inconvenient places. And so much of that now happens online. So the cost of it is lower, and it's easier to get a protest going, which can be in many ways effective for political action. But the community building aspect of it is also lower, because community actually is often about costs. It's about, this is the thing that I now, as I'm heading into my 50s, the weird thing that I am discovering is how much of what I value is the things that required me to do things I really didn't want to do at the time. Like the people, the relationships that imposed significant costs on me. And so I don't think that the post-college communities tend to be thick organizing communities like the ones that I grew up with in the 90s. They seem to have changed and to be very thin and just mostly focus around assembling for protests and then disassembling. And again, I think it is different on campus, but there used to be a large, very active, kind of activist community in a way that I do not see as much now.
I would just like to take a second to respond to that. Because you don't know me, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. So I'm actually a second
Quickly.
generation. Yeah, I'm a second generation Caribbean African immigrant. So my experiences amongst the Black community, but also amongst other white people, is very, different and diverse. Something that I seem to notice about white people is that you guys come together in groups for a moment and then immediately disperse, because finding community inside and out of college is actually easier for people who, you could say, adhere to identity politics, because we understand that community is forged by doing the things that you don't like consistently, not just on a political agenda, but also making sure that somebody has a Band-Aid or a place to live at, or literally anything you could choose. Community is not just about, rah, rah, rah out in the streets. It's additional to that because systematic oppression keeps us down. So my final question for you, because I know other people would like to speak, is this actually a American problem, like you said, to unify, or is this white America understanding that they actually have no idea what community means outside of a political agenda?
I mean, as a white person who comes out of, my mom's from a small town, my father's from an incredibly thick Irish Catholic community in Boston, I would take issue with that. That may be your experience of white people. I can't speak to that. It is not my experience of white people. I think it's a fair characterization of a pretty narrow slice of the white upper middle class. But that's not most of them, right? My aunt lives in the same town where my family has lived since around the year 1800. And she lives in my grandparents' house, which is now her house. And I think it is different. It is true of mobile peoples in general, right? The more you preserve mobility for work, the less ability you have to form community. But I don't think that that's certainly in my experience correct.
I'd like to remind everybody that our topic is the future of conservatism. And I'd like to maybe take questions related to that. On point?
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, everybody can hear me? Great. So I think the thing that I'm struggling to square a little bit is the idea that opposite wokeness, quote unquote wokeness, is necessarily religious-based conservative community. And I think that if you go to those communities in Youngstown and Peoria, in mid-Missouri or whatever, where the new right is appealing, but the new right is not on the ground doing the work, I don't think you're necessarily going to find, you know, good, God-fearing, every Sunday churchgoers. You're just going to find people who are generally culturally conservative and don't like what they feel as excessively socially liberal imposition. So what's the community for them oriented around? Because I definitely don't think it's going to be the new right academics flying in from Cambridge to tell them they need to come closer to God.
Josh, you want to take that?
Look, my view is that all the churches are a mess. And that's part of the reason why I think we have this problem with identity politics in the first place. And I see very little evidence that the churches are going to be at all. I'm going 40,000 feet here. You know, we were told a myth in the early 60s, which was America is a pluralist country. And I think that's what you want. And that's what I want. It's a pluralist country. But the problem was, it became clear initially that blacks weren't part of the bargain, and women were not part of the bargain. And I think that has morphed now. And I think that was a constructive period, I will say. Because there were, you know, pluralism is supposed to include everyone, and then it turns out there's groups that are invisible. And so what do you do with that? And I think that's what we've been wrestling with. And I think the attempt to wrestle with that has become pathological in the form of identity politics. I do not, however, have, and I don't think you're proposing one either. We do need to get back to some kind of pluralism. The phrase I use is just enough liberalism. It is, to me, a huge mistake not to admit that most of us, until maybe third or fourth generation, have these deep family networks. You with your Irish family, me with my Lebanese family in Worcester. I mean, a couple of generations out, it goes away. But the Americans aren't prepared to say, well, let's just have just enough liberalism. So Bob Woodson, I'm going to cite in a minute, more in a second. He says the opposite of segregation is not integration, it's desegregation. What does that mean? It means, of course, you shouldn't be forced to live in one area, but to be forced to be integrated, that's not right either. If groups want to live with their kind, I'll say it. Tell me what's wrong with that, really. My Lebanese ancestors could never have succeeded. And I think very few families could have succeeded if they hadn't started out by living with their kind. So I think what we should do is, instead of having this delusion that we're all going to become disembodied liberals, we have to have this just enough liberalism idea. So sure, we're moving toward a robust pluralism, which is inattentive to the predicates that attend us. But let's not pretend that we don't have that. That's, in a way, the genius of America, too. Second, on the 1619 project, I will say, I agree with you, Megan, that conservatives have made a terrible mistake by taking race off the table, because what that means is identity politics has jumped in. And I think it's been a disaster for Black America. And this earlier in the group, to the class, I'll say it right now. So when 1619 came out, Bob Woodson gathered a number of Black conservatives. And for a year and a half, they talked. And they said, here's Bob, Glenn Lowry too. Here's the problem. Conservatives and identitarians actually have the same premise. What is that? Something is only able to be vindicated if it's pure. And so the 1619 project said America is impure, therefore cannot be vindicated. And the conservatives said, no, it's pure. We can vindicate it. It can be vindicated because the founding is pure. Both of those are wrong. It's starting from the same supposition. The ugly truth is we had slavery. But if you think the moral lesson of the 1619 project, which is this is systemic, and therefore it's so large that you alone, you with your friends, you with your family, and you with your community cannot solve it, then that contributes to the malaise that is in Black thought today. Bob Woodson, who's 87 years old, talks about what was happening in the Black community in the 1960s. There were huge disagreements, but every group believed in Black agency. And what do we have with the 1619 project? Oh, systemic racism, it's too big for me to handle. Maybe even the state can't handle it because whites are just racist. That will not do. And that's where we are in America right now. We are a country without hope, which is why Bob wrote this book called Red, White, and Black. He rejected both hypotheses. No, America is not pure, but we build from our wounds, and we say suffering is not the final word on everything. And that is the great crisis right now. So I object to the 19 Project on the basis of the moral lesson it teaches young people, which is there's nothing you can do. And that is deplorable.
Okay, let's keep going around. Good question here. The student, and then we'll open it up to.
I have a quick question. As a white Christian man, how pushed away by the Democratic Party, how can the Republican Party go? Do they go more to the right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Do you go more to the right as if you're the Republican Party, or do you go more towards the center?
I vote for the center, but look, I think both parties actually have this problem, is that they have been chasing their most extreme, right? So if you look at what happened in the Democratic primary in 2019 and 2020, basically everyone has a terminal case of Twitter brain, and they are chasing a group of voters that's about 7% of the electorate. They're not even a majority of the Democratic electorate. And who was the guy who won? He was the guy who did not chase that part of the electorate, and instead went to the black vote, which is more moderate within the Democratic Party than the progressive wing, right? So he pursued those voters. He got Jim Clyburn's endorsement, swept South Carolina, and the rest is history. I think Republicans make the same mistake, and I think that, like, watching what's happening in the Trump administration, look, there is some argument that you just, you're in, you use your power, and then you're going to lose power, and that's what power is for. And I have heard that argument made, for example, by the people who voted for Obamacare and then lost their seats because it was unpopular in its initial years. And that's a totally fair argument about politics. But as a political party, I just want this 7% of the voters is not a good strategy. And I think Biden discovered that. He kind of weirdly, he's the only candidate I know who governed and ran in the general to the left of where he was running in the primary. And I think it is a mistake for conservatives. You do get some people, but you lose a lot more. And I think the way you earn people's votes is by treating them with respect. I think the tendency to demonize not just the other side's politicians, that's how politics works. But what we've got now is parties that are demonizing the other side's voters. And I will go back to, those people are Americans, and you do not have a right to denigrate those people. They have a right, absolutely as much right to vote and to have an opinion as you do, every single one of them. And that element of our politics is extremely disturbing to me. So what I would like to see is parties moving more towards the center, like not overlapping entirely, but fighting for a more centrist position. But more importantly, not running against the voters on the other side, because that is just toxic for the country. And I also think bad politics.
Quick answer to that, Josh?
No, honestly.
Okay, all right. Then we have the girl in the sweatshirt, and then Michael Kochin.
Hi. So we've been something that I think both of you talked about was about how the left is a lot of the time over concerned with the minutia of identity politics or the academic discussion, and how the right kind of is unaccustomed to compromise. Is there any world where the right and left can kind of help each other solve those problems that they each have, or does it have to be from within through each side before that compromise can be reached?
For the moment, I don't have much hope, honestly. I see communities torn apart. I see families torn right down the middle over this issue. Or, one party in the family controls the moral discourse, and other things are just ruled out. So the crisis that we have goes right down to within the family. With respect to academics, I've been wrestling for 15 years. I guess I'm the last conservative at Georgetown. It's a pretty lonely place when you have 400 faculty members. You can talk to 2 of them. That's a problem. And I don't see any evidence whatsoever that higher administration will do anything to redress the balance. Nothing. So I think what has to happen is you have to, it's happening right now, build out these civics programs. But the problem there, and Megan and I will agree on this one, is that you get monoculture there, and that's not a great idea. And then the other possibility is when the great demographic collapse hits the colleges in 2025, 2026, there's going to be a lot of small colleges up for sale, and you buy them and you start over.
One of my more amusing opinions is that if you think about what it would take to bring conservatives into the university, right? Because it does look almost hopeless, actually. Partly because there's this horizontal and a vertical organization. So like, even if you in your university are like, we are committed to viewpoint diversity, we are going to really make an effort to hire conservatives. And to get that viewpoint diversity in the room, not because we think it's mean to conservatives, but because we think it will make us better. The conservatives will ask some of the questions we're forgetting to ask. They will make us live up to our they will not let us get away with any lazy thinking. Okay, so we're going to bring some of those grad students in. Where are those people getting jobs? Right, a university is this weird thing of like, it exists both in that, you can't, and the disciplines exert their own discipline. And so I don't even know how it's reformable, but let's say you were going to do this. Academia-wide, everyone decides, okay, we're going to do this. Like, what would it look like? Well, it would look a lot like affirmative action in DEI, right? You'd be like, wow, we've got 4 hires coming up. We want 2 of them for, no, you know what, 3. We're really short on conservatives. We're going to do three hires for conservatives. And you know what, like, we might have trouble getting them because like there's no conservatives here. So we better do some outreach, some aggressive recruiting. We better, have a brochure featuring some guys frolicking with their copies of Russell Kirk on the college campus. We better have an affinity group for them so that, because like there's only going to be 3 in the department, they're going to feel really lonely. So we'll do a university-wide affinity group, right? Like it would look like DEI. It would look like not some of the more excessive stuff that happened towards the end, but that would be, right? And I think conservatives should think about that. Is that to go back to, a lot of what they're freaking out about is attempts to solve real problems that are real problems with America. And I think we differ a little bit in that, like, I think the solution is to curb some of the excesses and the language policing and the endless and the sort of, you can't say that. I think the you can't say that was a disaster. But I think that the general idea of attempting to keep places diverse and attempting to make the people who were there feel not alienated from them, it's like something we should do. And so, navigating those choices is difficult, but I think it had to happen. And I think conservatives may want to rethink that as they think about diversifying liberal institutions.
Okay, we got a question from Michael Cochin here, and then we've got questions online.
Ms. McArdle, when you were talking, I was thinking about something I'm old enough to remember almost as an adult, and I think maybe you're not, which is the fall of communism in countries like Poland and the Czech Republic.
Bless you, child. I was 16.
And, first of all, what you said about being stuck on the old issues reminded me a little bit about how the Solidarity people actually used to talk about the future of Poland. And what we now know is that there was no way to know the future of Poland after you got into the country. It's completely different. What you talked about in terms of language policing, regaining free speech, seems to me we have a lot to learn from what they actually did in these countries. What they did was lustration. You had a lot of people with a lot of power whose education and habits completely unsuited them to positions of power in a free society, and so they were purged completely. So and I think that the problems in, you mentioned the economist at Harvard, Claudine Gay, tried to wreck him personally and professionally and was rewarded by being made president of Harvard, right? So that suggests the problems are really serious. The solutions have to be really serious. They have to be radical, and we shouldn't necessarily anticipate that the political groups that will emerge once we have an elite suitable for a free society are going to look anything like what we have today.
Look, would I argue that you should select college presidents based on their commitment to free speech? Uh-huh. I mean, like, not literally the only thing. There are probably other considerations I don't know about. But I agree with that. But I think that when we start talking about purges, again, what did we just live through from 2020 to 2022? It was progressives saying, let's purge all the institutions of conservatives. And look, as a right-leaning person in a liberal institution, I do not like that. I can attest it is unpleasant to have people out there suggesting you should be fired every day. But I also think, look, I don't think it's that drastic. Look, I think the problem of reforming universities is to have more viewpoint diversity, which I think is more important not to be nice to conservatives, but because of the epistemic problem of not having that viewpoint diversity. Conservatives, like, they're okay. They're not going to starve. But I don't think, what are you going to fire all the professors? You're just going to get new ones? It takes a while to train a biologist. I mean, I look at what they're doing to research, and like, there is definitely excess there. And there also looks like they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I like scientific progress enough. I like humanities enough that I don't want just to toss the baby in the snow and tell it, go free, young one. I think we need, but the problem is it's slow, right? Like, it's really slow. And with the fall of communism, it's a little different. Communism has not fallen. The universities are still basically functioning. We don't need a new government just to, I don't know. I understand that is the conservative argument. But I think my conservative temperament is that I am skeptical of all, like, we need to throw everything out and start over. It's year zero.
Okay, online question.
So first, can you hear me? Is this on? It's striking the future of progressivism panel was much more upbeat. I have to say, if you might not have noticed, the conservatives own the present, but this has been a completely depressing panel. So I'll just
Yes, but conservatives are inherently skeptical of the future.
I understand. So here's a question. I think this is a question for Professor Mitchell. What's the relationship between liberalism and conservatism? It seems that what we refer to as modern American conservatism rests on the fundamental assumptions of liberalism. And perhaps this is the post-liberal / unitarian critique. Can you say something to that?
So I 34 years ago, I started out in the debates about liberalism, and I just walked away from it because I am so done with the term, sorry to say, because it is being used as a train to tenure. Liberal individualism, the great question is what's ontologically prior, man as a communal being, man as an individual. My view is that is completely dead in the water. I know there's a lot, friends of mine, I have friends who do this, who think, okay, we're now living in the post-liberal moment. No, I don't believe we are. I think that Tocquevillian liberalism, which is about embodied communities and face-to-face relations, and citizens who are aware of the perils of individualism and are not prepared to embrace collectivism, I think that is absolutely the right way to go. And so flirtations with post-liberalism, I don't even listen to them. I mean, I'm part of the NatCon movement, and Yoram is a dear friend of mine. But I say, Yoram, I'm a Tocquevillian liberal. If you want to have me, great. But I'm not exactly sure why you're pushing back against liberalism. If you just mean by that the individual, the fixation on the individual, yeah, I agree. That was Tocqueville. So I'm very nervous about this claim that we live in a postmodern or post-liberal moment. Americans are always impatient with the present, and so they want to have something new. And so it's going to be, now we're post-liberal. Don't believe it.
I don't even know how you could imagine a non-liberal America. I mean, in a deep way, right? It's like the integralists. Look, I'm Catholic, so theoretically,
Seem to be imagining it.
well, I mean, what is the method by which the Pope runs a country that is not majority Catholic? I don't understand. It's like the underpants gnome, like blah blah blah, question mark, and then Pope running things. So I don't get I think that America just fundamentally, I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to like the Danish people who are like, we like being Danish and we only want immigrants who assimilate. In the same way that I'm very sympathetic to people who are like, I don't want European people coming to my country and settling there, right? Like, but in America, we're everything, and that is the American identity. And maybe in 1820, we could argue about that, but in 2020, we cannot. That's who we are. And so the idea, like, you need liberalism to handle that problem. Liberalism was invented to handle the problem of religious diversity. And I don't see, but it has been expanded to handle the problem of lots of kinds of diversity. And I cannot imagine what an America without that. How would you govern this massive, amazing, heterogeneous, fractious populace without the live and let live? I don't know. I think I'm right, but maybe not. I'm going to let you do you. I don't know how it would.
We're getting low on time. You want to take a few more? Why don't you just read what other questions there are, and we'll let the panelists pick and choose.
So there are two, and I'll try to speak into the microphone. Our friend David Fott writes, is the focus of Trump and his acolytes on identity politics an attempt to avoid attention from tax cuts, which is bound to divide rich from poor and alienate the latter, who are a large part of Trump's constituency? That's question number one. Question number two from our former student, Alex Rabinowitz. Could the economy of identity politics, in quotation marks, really just be another religious great awakening without the structure of organized religion? I think that might be for you, Josh. Could this have emerged due to the failures of technocratic rule in the American post-World War II order?
Well, on that second one, my argument is, I know you had a session on progressivism last week or whenever it was. I don't think we're living in a progressive era. I think even those on the left who say they're progressive don't understand what progressivism was trying to do, which was supplant citizen competence. The founders thought that citizen competence was up to the task of government and therefore modest government. Around the 1880s, people start looking around saying, well, you know, it's pretty complicated here. And you've got big corporations, and maybe they need to be checked, and the power of the state needs to grow. And the new idea from 1880 to almost the present was expert competence. It's still competence. And my view is that, that universities are not teaching that. On the side they are, but it's to your point about luxury ideas. That what's really being adjudicated at university, what's being established, is do you speak the right language? Do you have the right luxury ideas? We've moved way past the development of expert competence. So my view is we're in a third stage of American history. And the question is whether we're going back. First stage, founders; second stage, progressivism; third stage, which we were eking toward, is identity politics, where you're not concerned with expert competence, but rather innocent victimhood at the elite levels at the colleges. And I think there's a great pushback against that right now. I don't know if it's permanent, but in my view, this is a move back to competence. There'll be reckless excess, but we literally will not be able to build a world on a faux religion. Look, I remind you, Marxism was this too. It didn't have the church apparatus, but it was an incomplete religion. Eric Voegelin saw this. Lots of people saw this. So you don't have to have the church mechanism. You can have all sorts of secondary ones, workers groups, et cetera, that gather people together around the subject of who's the innocent victim and who's the transgressor and who needs to be purged and thrown out of church.
On the first question, I think people really overestimate the unpopularity of tax cuts. It's not that you can't get people to say in a poll that, like, you should not cut taxes on billionaires, but they don't care. They're not going to vote on that. You can cut taxes on billionaires all you want, and no one is going to switch their vote from the other party to you. That's not to say that there aren't people, but the people who really care about that, who are on fire and get up to email everyone, are already voting for Democrats. They're not gettable voters for you. So I don't think that's why they're doing the identity politics stuff. I think they're doing the identity politics stuff, first of all, because it's popular, right? A lot of this stuff, again, 80-20 issues, and they're on the right side of the 80. And also because it's easy to explain. And people really underestimate the extent to which stuff in Washington is just driven by, can I explain this in 1 minute on television or TikTok now? And like the Elizabeth Warren going after the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which had been a Depression era regulation, had nothing to do with the financial crisis. But she loved talking about it. Why? Because you can explain it in a minute on television. And so I think that's why they're hitting this stuff so hard. It's fast, it's a quick win for them, and it is very easy to explain. The risk of that is that really for this political tactic to work, they're dependent on the left to keep generating incidents for them to get mad about. They're shortly going to run out of those incidents. And then they're going to have to get into stuff that's cruel, right? It is one thing to say, you know what, we're going to keep sports leagues for biological women. It is another thing to say, like, you know what, we're kicking all the trans people out of the military, or we're going to repeal the rules that protect their ability to get housing and medical care, or to, to facing employment discrimination and all that. Like, that is going to be a different thing. And there's a lot of issues like that down the line where they have picked the low-hanging fruit. There's not that much of it. And the left has largely stopped obliging by creating new ones. And they're quickly going to get into territory that's very unpopular, and I also think morally wrong, but that's a separate issue.
I have a slightly take here. My view is part of what's going on with the trans issue is this question. Is there such a thing as nature, human nature? And it strikes me that the left has basically decided, nope, it's all socially constituted. So I get it. Every political party needs a slogan to raise money, and that's what's happening. But there is a deeper issue, and that is whether there is in fact a nature, and whether we build a society on the fact that there is a nature. That there's 1 trillion cells in your body, and you can't rewire them from estrogen-based to testosterone-based. You cannot do it. And then natural differences between men and women, which I think the left has also pushed toward. Let me just say one thing finally, because a lot of people have been raising it. So how do we rebuild Youngstown? And I just want to alert you to a problem that's already there in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So the Wealth of Nations, 1776, the first 100 pages lay out what you need to do to have global wealth. Globally extensive markets, maximum division of labor. Those two things co-related produce the most wealth on the planet. And then there's the rest of the book after 100 pages. And in the rest of the book, he says, but wait a minute, there's a problem. We live in political communities. Here's the economic formula, but we live in political communities. And the problem is the Reaganites forward they lost. They only taught the first 100 pages of Adam Smith. And as a consequence, we had no understanding that Smith, the great defender of what we might call capitalism, he doesn't use the term, never would have said you just export everything, because it's about trade-offs. But the problem, this is, I think, to your point also about conservatives, they build slowly, they're a little skeptical, there's you do this, but there's also that. And this problem, which first originates in Adam Smith in 1776, has not been solved. We have to be clear. This isn't a Trump problem or a Democratic problem. This theoretical problem of how you both have a political community and global growth has not been solved.
Can I say one closing thing? No, I was accused of being gloomy. Like, look,
I thought you were going to say wrong.
no, I think, oh yeah, wrong. Sorry, we were talking about you children do not know, but there used to be a show called the McLaughlin Group where that happened periodically. No, I'm not disagreeing with this. I'm actually I've been musing on this, and I'm seizing the mic to say, I'm actually not gloomy about America. I think we got a lot of problems, but you know what? We've always had a lot of problems. Look back to any decade in history and think, like, where is the decade? Okay, 1952 to 1955, or 1968 to 1973. But end of the year I was born, everything good did. But look, America's always had a lot of problems, and we've always had a lot of promise. We've had a lot of ethnic contention. We committed genocide against the Native Americans. We enslaved millions of Africans. We also invented the light bulb and crossed the West and did a lot of amazing things. Those are all part of America. But this is, to me, in the greatest country on earth. And we are fortunate to live here. And the future is not dark. We're going to get through this because we do, because we're Americans. So I just wanted to say that I'm not gloomy at all. I think the Republican Party has some problems to sort out, and so does the Democratic Party, but I have faith.
Well, for a panel on the future of conservatism with a conservative president and both chambers of Congress controlled by conservatives, there's very little conversation about national politics. But that fits conservative intellectuals who don't see government as the solution. There was a lot of talk tonight, though, on about universities, and it is a real indictment of universities that the conversation that takes place here and the universities generally is narrower, and the range of opinions expressed is narrower than in the country as a whole. It's supposed to be the opposite. And this panel today was a gesture towards remedying that at American University. So thank you for coming, everybody. Thank you.